I'm only proud of my eldest son, my mother said piercingly at a family gathering, and the room seemed to freeze. The family looked at each other and whispered, but I remained silent, clenching my fists inside. They didn't know that everything I did was part of my plan, and soon everything they knew about the family would be turned upside down. Hi, this is Arena of Revenge. Here you'll find exciting stories with gripping plots and vengeance. Follow us. Family gatherings were always a chore, like going to the dentist, unpleasant, but somehow necessary. Mom hosted them every couple of months in her old house on the outskirts of Cleveland, Ohio. The house was like her, loud, with a tired smile, peeling paint on the walls, and endless conversations about how everything used to be better. She loved it when everyone was around the table. Older brother Michael with his perfect wife, younger sister Martha with a guy who looked like he'd just been dragged out of a frat bar, and me, the one who always showed up alone. Mom would prepare a ton of food in advance, pretending it was a celebration. But in reality, it turned into a show called Mom's Version of Family Idol. There was a forced politeness at the table. Everyone was smiling, joking, and the air was thick with tension you could cut with a knife. Mom started talking again about how proud she was that Michael became a lawyer, that he had a stable job in Chicago, and that his wife was a real find. I picked at my potatoes with my fork and thought I'd heard this monologue for the 100th time. She always oscillated between two states, delight in Michael and disappointment in me. I worked in a car repair shop. I didn't have a college degree, but I knew how to use my hands and earned enough to live. It didn't matter to her. She believed that if you didn't have a degree and an office, you were nobody. At some point, the conversation turned to the children and who they had become. Michael, with an air of importance, recounted how he'd won yet another case, and Mom listened as if he were the president. Then she looked at me, and at that moment I knew something was about to happen. She looked me straight in the eyes in front of everyone and calmly said, "I'm only proud of my eldest son." The room fell silent. Even the television in the background seemed to stop making noise. Michael awkwardly looked away. Martha tried to smile. Someone coughed quietly, but no one said anything. Mom continued pouring wine as if nothing out of the ordinary had happened. I grinned, even though everything inside me was twisted. It felt like someone had slapped me across the face. This phrase sounded more than just offensive. It seemed to put an end to everything, as if everything I had done had no meaning. After dinner, I went out into the backyard. The air was damp, smelling of gasoline and wet grass. I stood looking at the old wooden fence, feeling anger rising from within, like steam from a pan. Martha followed me out, brought a beer, handed me a can, and sat down next to me. She started saying that Mom was just old, that she didn't think, that she was saying things, that this was her way of asserting herself. But I knew Mom understood everything. She always hurt precisely and accurately, not by accident, but as if with calculation. Growing up, she compared Michael to me constantly. When I got a B, she'd say Michael only got A's at my age. When I started working in the garage, she'd say I smelled like oil and that a man should smell like success, not gasoline. It all lingered in my memory like scars. And now, when she said that, I realized nothing had changed. The evening ended awkwardly. Mom, as usual, was handing out lunch boxes to everyone, kissing Michael on the cheek and thanking him for not forgetting his family. She simply glanced past me. I left without saying goodbye. In the car on the way back, my hands were shaking, my thoughts were racing, anger mixed with fatigue. I wanted to stop somewhere and take a breath, but I just drove, looking at the road and remembering everything she'd ever said. Maybe I really was a loser by her standards. Maybe I just wasn't who she wanted me to be, but something inside me clicked. That night, I couldn't sleep. I sat in the kitchen, drank cheap whiskey, and turned her words over and over in my head. They wouldn't go away. "I'm only proud of my eldest son." They echoed, as if someone were deliberately repeating them over and over. I realized I couldn't just endure it anymore. I wasn't going to start a scene or take my anger out on anyone. But I knew one thing: Mom always valued showmanship. The only way to hurt her was through that, through her own love for other people's opinions. And then I had an idea of how to turn things around without raising my voice or causing a scene. Simply make her see that the one she isn't proud of is capable of so much more than her perfect son. And then she'd have to look at me differently. The day after that meeting, I woke up with a heavy head, as if I'd been drunk even though I hadn't been drinking much. The work week had been hectic, the shop was a mess, and one customer had brought in an old Ford in such a state it would have been easier to burn. But thoughts of my mother wouldn't leave me. Every word she said, the way she looked at me, as if I simply didn't belong at that table. A couple of weeks passed, and I almost stopped thinking about it until the phone rang. Her number appeared on the screen. At first, I considered not picking it up, but then I finally answered. Her voice was irritated, but not rude. She said her car wouldn't start and Michael was too busy to come. Then she added that since I knew all things hardware, I might stop by. I agreed, though my insides sank. I arrived at her house that evening, just as it was getting dark. In the driveway was the old sedan I'd once helped her choose. She came out onto the porch, wearing a coat and holding a mug of tea, watching me open the hood. The air was cold and smelled of wet earth and leaves. I crawled under the hood, checked the battery, the wires, the starter. It turned out to be a minor issue. A wire had come loose. I fixed it in about 20 minutes. She stood there the whole time, commenting on how the car was always acting up and how Michael had told her to buy a new one. When the engine finally started, for some reason she didn't thank me, just nodded and added that at least I had hands that can do something. The word stuck inside like a splinter. I wanted to reply, but I simply wiped my hands on a rag and closed the hood. She invited me in, saying she wanted to have coffee. The house was the same, old wallpaper, the smell of perfume, and the burning of the oven. On the table sat a plate with a pie, which she had apparently baked for guests, but then changed her mind about inviting anyone over. She sat down across from me and started telling me how well Michael was doing, how his wife was pregnant, and how she was expecting a grandson soon. I listened, nodding, though inside I was seething. Then she casually asked if I had anyone. I said no. She nodded with the same expression, as if confirming her conclusions about my worthlessness. Then she added that at my age, it would be nice to start a family by now. Otherwise you'll grow old alone like a fool. I pretended I hadn't heard. I drank coffee and looked out the window, where her figures on the shelf were reflected. Michael in a suit, Michael with his wife, Michael at graduation. Not a single photo of me. Something ached in my chest. She continued talking as if she didn't notice how each word cut a raw nerve. Then suddenly she said that Michael had promised to help her renovate the kitchen, but he didn't have time. Maybe I could do it since my job isn't that important. These words sounded like a slap in the face. I stood up, said I'd think about it, and headed for the door. As I was leaving, she said, "At least be grateful I trust you to touch up the house." I exhaled, got in the car, and just sat there for a few minutes, staring at her windows. Anger and fatigue were mingling. I wanted to leave and forget everything, but a thought arose inside me. If she thinks I'm worthless, then at least let her see how wrong she is. A few days later, I finally returned. I brought tools, bought paint, and started renovating the kitchen, although she didn't even ask why I was doing it. She simply walked around, commenting on how I wasn't holding the brush correctly, that the walls were uneven, that Michael could have done a better job. With every word she said, it became harder and harder for me to restrain myself, but I decided to finish the job. 3 days later, the kitchen looked like new, bright, clean, tidy. She came in, looked around, nodded, and said it was not bad for a first try. I chuckled, packed up my tools, and left without waiting for more criticism. That evening, I realized she was impossible to please. But deep down, a strange certainty arose. Now I knew where her weak spot was. She was used to humiliating people with words, but she didn't know how to react when someone simply did things without asking for approval. And this, oddly enough, calmed me down a little. I drove home, and for the first time in a long time, I felt no anger, only cold determination. After that evening with the kitchen, I realized that for the first time I could act not for the approval of others, but for myself. It felt strange and unfamiliar, as if I'd finally freed myself from all the old shackles. I spent several days in the workshop, not just fixing cars, but considering what I could actually do for myself. I began to see opportunities where I'd previously seen only routine: abandoned buildings, old garages, empty lots that stood unused. And it was during these days that one of the clients who regularly left their cars with me noticed that I was acting differently, more confident, calmer, more collected. He mentioned an old garage on the outskirts of town, abandoned for 10 years, and suggested that if I took it upon myself to restore it, it could be transformed into a workspace and generate income, and most importantly, give me the opportunity to prove myself. At first, I thought it was too difficult, that I couldn't handle it alone, But then I remembered the way my mom looked at me after the kitchen renovation, how she tried to belittle me, and I realized I wanted to do it for myself, for that feeling of empowerment I'd experienced for the first time. I agreed. I began planning every step, purchasing materials, finding workers, negotiating with suppliers, delegating tasks. I knew I'd have to face difficulties, problems that seemed insurmountable, but now I had a determination within me that gave me the strength to overcome any obstacle. My mom found out almost immediately and, of course, couldn't resist commenting that it was too much work for me, that I couldn't handle it, that Michael would do it faster. Before, such words would unsettle me, make me feel worthless, but now they only spurred me on, like a challenge to be overcome. Every day on site, I encountered unexpected problems. A leaky roof, a sagging floor, old electrical wiring, delays in the delivery of materials. Every time I tackled a task, I learned from my mistakes, learned to negotiate with the workers, make decisions, and embrace responsibility. And with each passing day, I saw something tangible emerge from the ruins, something truly meaningful, something I was truly creating myself. People began to notice the changes. Familiar clients, neighbors, and random passers-by were amazed at how one person could handle such a volume of work, and this gave me confidence. In the second week of work, an investor who had heard about the project, through a friend, offered to invest in turning the garage into a workshop, with the possibility of renting out part of the space. I almost fell down the stairs in amazement. This was an opportunity I had previously only dreamed of, and I knew I was ready to seize it. From that moment on, the project grew even faster. Every day brought new challenges, unexpected difficulties, solutions that had to be invented on the spot, and every victory over a difficulty gave me the feeling that I was truly building my life. Mom would occasionally drop by the site under any pretext to watch me work and try to offer feedback. What I was doing wrong, what Michael could do better, that I lacked patience. But now her words felt different, like background noise, like noise that couldn't stop my actions. And the more I saw the results, the less their criticism mattered. Every evening, as the sun set, I stood on the roof of the garage and looked at what I had created. A wasteland that had once been a useless pile of bricks and rubble was now being transformed into a workspace that could generate income, that had real value, that I had built with my own hands. I thought about Mom, about her words, which had previously cut and offended, and now they sounded like empty background noise compared to what I was actually doing. A feeling of pride, inner freedom, and strength filled me to the brim. For the first time, I realized that I could make my own decisions and build my life the way I wanted, not the way someone else thought was right. Every day brought new opportunities, negotiating with workers, dealing with unexpected situations, correcting others' mistakes, finding solutions to problems with materials and space management. And all of this made me stronger and more confident. I began to understand that this project wasn't just a job, but a symbol of emerging from the shadows, a symbol of being able to be myself and achieve results without needing my mother's approval. The more I took action, the more confident I became that my actions were now more important than her words, that I could prove to myself that I was capable of great things, that my life belonged only to me. And as I left the playground, tired and with calloused hands, I felt like I'd taken the first step toward true independence, toward a life built on my own decisions and actions, not on the expectations of others. And this feeling that I could now create and control my future was incredibly powerful and liberating, because for the first time, I realized that I could be the master of my own destiny, that I could prove to myself and others that I was capable of more than my mother ever expected, simply by taking action step by step, solving each problem and building my own space, my own future, my own present. After standing on the garage roof, looking at everything I'd created with my own hands, and feeling an inner strength, I began to realize I could now do what had previously seemed impossible. The project was gradually becoming a reality, and by this point I'd realized I wasn't just working, but actually managing my life. Thoughts of my mother, her words, and how she always belittled me, how she only praised Michael and didn't see that I was capable of more, swirled in my head. I realized that the most powerful weapon for revenge isn't verbal reproaches or scandals, but rather one's own actions and accomplishments, which are impossible to ignore. With each day of work, I grew more confident. The project grew. And by the end of the month, the garage looked almost finished, and the first potential clients and investors began contacting me, wanting to invest or rent part of the space. I caught myself thinking that this would have been impossible just a few months ago, when my mother told me I'd never amount to anything, that I was wasting my time on nonsense, and that Michael was the only one worth having. Now I saw that her words had no power, that I could prove to myself and everyone around me that she was wrong. One day, an investor approached me and offered to formalize the investment, turning the garage into a fully fledged workshop with the possibility of renting it out and expanding the business. I felt a surge of joy and strength at the same time, and then, for the first time, I realized that my mother's true revenge wasn't scandals and reproaches, but my independence and success, which she couldn't challenge. I began actively working on documents, negotiating with clients, overseeing every detail of the project, and I did all this with particular pleasure because I knew that every step I took was another blow to her habit of considering me unworthy. When my mother came to the site yet again, under the guise of curiosity, to see what I was doing, I saw her eyes full of surprise and uncertainty, as if she were realizing for the first time that her eldest son wasn't the only successful one, and that I could exceed her expectations without arguing or demanding approval, just by taking action. She tried to interject her usual comments, but I listened to them as noise, and this only increased my inner satisfaction. Now the power of words had passed from her to me, only through action and results. The project grew with each passing day. New clients, new problems to solve, and each difficulty only demonstrated that I had become stronger and more experienced, that I could now handle situations that had previously seemed insurmountable. I oversaw the entire process, assigning tasks, handling purchases, coordinating leases, and organizing premises, and I did it all with a sense of freedom and inner triumph. I understood that every step, every decision, was part of my revenge on my mother, quiet but precise, through a demonstration of independence and strength that she could never subjugate with her words. Over time, the project began to generate its first income, and I formalized everything, opened accounts, handled contracts and clients, all the while enjoying the thought that my mother saw me succeed, and that her usual reproaches and attempts at control no longer mattered. Sometimes she would approach and try to intervene, but I only allowed her to observe, demonstrating that I was now in control of the situation and my life, and she was just a guest in this process. I began to expand the project, making the garage layout more functional, adding rental spaces, negotiating partnerships, and with each step, I saw my independence becoming a reality. Every evening, I left the site tired, with calluses on my hands, but satisfied, realizing that my revenge on my mother was being realized not through words, but through actions, that she saw my strength, and I felt stronger than ever. And the more I acted, the more people noticed my project, the clearer it became that real revenge is a success that cannot be disputed, an independence that she does not possess, and the feeling that now I am building my own life, my decisions, my future, and her habit of humiliating me has become powerless. And every new step of the project, every decision, every successful contract, every difficulty overcome gave me a feeling of triumph and a calm, yet precise revenge that could not be stopped by words, criticism, or her usual skepticism, but only by actions, results, and my inner confidence, which grew with each passing day and made me the master not only of the project, but also of my own destiny, showing that I could be successful, independent, strong, and happy without her approval and without her control. This feeling became the main proof that the revenge was successful, quiet, but undeniable, because I did everything with my own hands, my own strength, my mind, my work, and she could only watch and come to terms with the fact that I had surpassed all her expectations and was now in complete control of my life. When I first saw my project taking off, I felt a sense of power I'd only dreamed of before, a sense of confidence that I could now control my life and my decisions, and that no one, especially my mother, could stop me or belittle me anymore. In the early days, when potential clients and investors started approaching me, I caught myself thinking that before, I'd always been afraid to even call, negotiate, or ask for help, but now I could decide for myself what was important and what wasn't. The project gradually grew, and each new day brought new challenges that made me want to tear my hair out. But at the same time, I was inwardly delighted by every little thing I was able to accomplish with my own hands. I did everything myself. I filled out paperwork, oversaw purchases, distributed tasks among workers, negotiated rent, and dealt with suppliers and clients. And yet, I felt genuine satisfaction, because I understood that every step I took was another step toward my independence, and thus, toward my revenge on my mother, who had always considered me weak and incapable. When she came to the site, out of old habit of observing and judging, I saw a mixture of surprise and displeasure in her eyes, and the feeling was so sweet that I couldn't help but smile. She tried to interject her usual comments, but I listened to them as background noise, realizing they no longer had any power over me. Each new project success was both proof of my strength and a measure of revenge. I showed my mother that I could be successful, strong, and independent without her approval or control. With each passing day, I grew more confident, expanding the project, adding new rental spaces, negotiating partnerships, resolving unexpected issues with suppliers and clients, and each time I felt completely in control, while my mother remained a mere observer. Gradually, the project began to generate real income, and I formalized everything, opened accounts, negotiated long-term contracts, and did all this with the understanding that my independence had now become a tool for revenge. My mother saw my achievements and understood that her usual words and control no longer worked. Sometimes she tried to intervene, offering help or advice, but I politely declined, demonstrating that I was now the decision-maker and her opinion no longer mattered. My revenge manifested itself not in shouting or conflict, but in the fact that she could no longer control me, that her usual authority had disappeared, and my actions and successes became the main argument against her criticism. With each passing day, the project expanded. I found new clients, resolved financial issues, made repairs and improvements to the premises, all the while enjoying the thought that my mother saw how independent and successful I had become, and that her traditional role as head of the family was crumbling. I was no longer a boy she could belittle. I was now an adult who made my own life, my own rules, my own decisions, and this feeling gave me deep inner satisfaction. I understood that revenge through independence is the most powerful weapon, and every step I took, every success, every day I demonstrated the power of my actions, reinforced the effect. My mother saw that her usual methods of pressure and control no longer worked, and I was gradually taking over as the master of my life and space. And with every new client, every successful deal, every little thing I improved in a project, I felt that revenge was completing its cycle. I became independent, successful, strong, and this feeling was sweet because it did not require scandals and shouting. It was quiet, confident, indisputable, and every little thing I did with my own hands strengthened my power over my life and destroyed the usual power of my mother. A feeling of triumph and satisfaction grew within me. The project was working, clients were coming, income was growing, and my mother was forced to watch and come to terms with the fact that her son was now independent and successful, and that her usual words no longer had any meaning, and I knew that this was the most precise and pure revenge that could be arranged. And the more I acted, the more the project developed, the clearer it became that I had achieved what she never expected, and now I was in control of my life, my affairs, my successes. And her usual control had completely disappeared, leaving her only an observer, and this feeling was sweet, because every step I took, every decision, every new success confirmed that revenge through independence had been carried out perfectly. After I got a taste of real independence and saw how my project really works, I realized that I can now act in relation to my mother, and do it calmly, without shouting and scandals, because the power is now on my side, and she is just an observer. I started with small things, helping her, but only on my terms, solving household issues, fixing the car, making small purchases and paying part of the bills, while watching how she tries to regain her usual control, but runs into my independence and determination. And this feeling gave me extraordinary satisfaction, because each of her attempts to intervene or put in her word ended with me calmly refusing or correctly showing that everything had already been decided by me. and she cannot influence my actions. Every day I expanded the project, attracted new clients, investors and partners, made repairs, added premises. All of this was beneficial to the business, and at the same time strengthened my power and independence. And my mother saw all of this clearly, trying to understand how her son was able to achieve something that she had never even imagined before, and at the same time remain calm and confident. Sometimes she tried to insert her advice or criticism, but I did not react to them in the usual way, but simply showed that I make the decisions, that she no longer has power. And this strategy worked perfectly, because she realized her powerlessness, and at the same time her dependence on me in small things that she could previously brush aside. But now she was forced to accept my help in order to maintain at least some comfort. I used this advantage gradually, without rushing. Each step was calculated, and the more I acted, the clearer it became that my revenge through independence had reached a new level, because my mother began to accept the fact that her usual control was gone, and I controlled not only the project, but also key aspects of our life together. Even if it was in a mundane sense, it was a subtle but powerful sense of triumph, because revenge was no longer expressed in scandals or insults, but in the fact that she depended on me in small things, and every time she came with a request or expectation, I could calmly manage the situation, decide what to do and what not, and see how this changed her habitual perception of me. With each new day, this dependence grew stronger. I helped financially, organized meetings, made minor repairs, resolved issues with documents and suppliers, and my mother understood that without me it would be more difficult for her, that her usual role as the boss had disappeared, and this feeling of satisfaction was sweet, because I acted correctly and calmly, without raising my voice, without creating scandals, but simply managing the situation through my own successes and independence. I saw her watching me, sometimes smiling quietly, sometimes silently, trying to evaluate my decisions, and in those looks I felt a mixture of surprise, discontent, and a growing recognition that I had become an independent, strong, and confident person who did not need her approval. Every victory of mine, every solved problem, every new client or income strengthened my power and showed her that revenge through addiction works perfectly, because she realizes that I am in control of my life and project, and her usual words and attempts at control no longer matter. I consciously built this process gradually, step by step, so that she gets used to the new reality and feels its consequences, and this was the most subtle and precise form of revenge. I control the situation, provide her with comfort, but on my terms, and every time she turned to me with a request, I calmly demonstrated that the power is now mine. Over time, I began to expand the project even further, negotiate with new clients and partners, improve the premises, add services, and I did all this in front of my mother, who watched as her usual power disappeared, and the more I acted, the clearer it became that my revenge had reached its climax. She depended on me, but she could not control me, and this feeling was sweet, because I achieved my goal without shouting and scandals, without humiliation, simply through calm strength and independence, through precise management of the situation and demonstration of my own success. I saw how she was getting used to her new role every day, how her usual confidence was gradually dissolving, and I understood that real revenge was this, that she was dependent, but not in control of the situation, that her usual methods of influence did not work, and I calmly and confidently continued to develop the project, manage processes, achieve success, and at the same time demonstrate that her power had disappeared and no longer mattered. And this feeling of triumph and satisfaction became the sweetest result of the whole story, because revenge through psychological dependence turned out to be accurate, strong, and completely controlled by me. And my mother was now forced to accept the new reality and come to terms with the fact that her son had become independent, successful, and completely in charge of his life, demonstrating that revenge can be calm, reasonable, but incredibly powerful and tangible. And every new step, every decision, every little thing in the project and in life reinforced the effect. My mother is dependent, but not in control of the situation, and I continue to manage everything and get inner satisfaction from the fact that revenge is completed through an accurate demonstration of strength, independence, and control, that she never was able to take it from me. As guests began to fill the room, I stood in the corner, observing every movement, feeling an unusual calm and confidence I'd never experienced before. My mother sat on the couch, trying to maintain her usual posture of authority, but her eyes were already showing growing confusion. She tried to say something, to intervene, but I knew that none of her comments would change what was happening now. The first clients approached me, and I led them around the room, showing them photos of the events, income graphs, thank you letters, and contracts, each time emphasizing that all these results were achieved through my efforts and decisions, without her intervention. I saw my mother purse her lips, the tension mounting, but she remained silent, understanding that she was now merely an observer and I was in control. My family and friends watched me closely, discussing the project's progress among themselves, and noticed how much I had changed. Confident, calm, in complete control of what was happening. I led the guests through the halls, showing off the team's work, demonstrating new capabilities, outlining promising expansion plans. Every time someone expressed surprise or admiration, I saw Mom try to interject, but she realized no one was listening. I explained the details of the work, showed new contracts, talked about thank you letters from clients, how successfully projects had been completed, how the team had expanded, and how processes had been improved. All the while, I noticed Mom growing quieter with every word, her usual control vanishing completely. I continued to demonstrate successes, calmly explaining each step, demonstrating that everything was working thanks to my competence and determination, not hers, and this feeling of inner triumph filled me completely. Guests asked questions. I answered confidently with a slight smile, and each time I saw Mom try to interject, but her words were lost in the distance, unnoticed, and this was the sweetest proof that my revenge was succeeding. I showed off expansion plans, new clients, new opportunities, talked about the team's development, demonstrated how I controlled every process, and every glance from guests and relatives intensified the vengeful effect, because they saw my independence and complete competence. From time to time, my mother tried to draw attention to herself, interject, criticize details, but I gently and calmly returned the conversation to the results, to the project, to the figures and facts, and each time I saw how she struggled to contain her confusion, how her usual authority was fading, how an internal feeling of helplessness and confusion was growing. I showed project photos, profit charts, letters of thanks, new contracts, talked about completed tasks and plans for the future, and all this happened before the eyes of the guests, who witnessed my confidence, leadership, and complete ability to control the situation. Relatives exchanged glances, noted the difference between what had been and what was happening now, and I saw how my mother realized that she no longer had any influence. Every step I took, every explanation, every demonstration of success became a weapon of revenge. Without shouting, without scandal, without insults, I demonstrated that power and control were in my hands, and that my mother's usual methods of pressure had completely lost their effectiveness. I continued to demonstrate the details of my work, talk about new projects, team expansion, client prospects, and each time I saw her trying to contain her emotions, but realizing that she was now merely an observer. I led the guests to the last rooms, showing off the most significant achievements: contracts with major clients, letters of gratitude, increased income, successful meetings, and projects. Each time I saw my mother trying to interject, but realizing that no one was listening. All of this was an accurate reflection of my independence and competence. Every step and word emphasized that now I was the only one making decisions, that the usual authority of my mother had finally disappeared. When the guests began to leave, I approached my mother and confidently showed that I was now the one making all the decisions in the project and in my life, and I saw her nod slightly, accepting this new reality, realizing that the usual control would no longer return. And this feeling of complete triumph and inner satisfaction filled me completely, because everything was achieved exactly as I planned, and no criticism, restrictions, or past humiliations mattered anymore. Now my every step and every result confirmed that I was the master of my life, the project and all decisions, and every look, every reaction of guests and relatives only emphasized my power, independence, and control. making it obvious that revenge was complete and my life was now completely under my control, that the feeling of strength, competence, and complete control was complete, and I understood that all the efforts and patience that I had shown led to this absolute victory, to this unconditional independence, and I felt that no longer could the usual power of my mother influence my life and decisions, that now I was completely free, successful, and could build my life the way I wanted, demonstrating to everyone my competence and strength. And this feeling of satisfaction, triumph, and complete realization of my goals filled me to the brim, making me smile inside, because everything happened exactly as I wanted, and now no past limitations, fears, or pressures have power over me.